And today we're going to start a conversation, or I guess continue a conversation with his book serving as the center, Radical Reparations, Healing the Soul of a Nation. Professor Marcus Anthony Hunter, always a pleasure to be in conversation with you. Welcome back to the show.
Hey, you already know. And I mean, what a lead in with the Rihanna. I mean, I had to brace myself and stay professional over here.
We try to be on brand. We try to be on brand. I have been telling the audience that I think your book is phenomenal. And as I am preparing for the installation of myself and my fellow commissioners in the New York State Reparations Commission, I have been doing as much education as I can on top of what was already there as my foundation on the topic of reparations in particular. Because I, like my other commissioners, we want to hit the ground running. And your book, Radical Reparations, has presented a really powerful way of envisioning reparations. And you've mentioned this before, but if you could just remind folks, you don't just deal with reparations in one context. You break it out into 7 categories. Help us remember what those categories are and why you chose that particular approach.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you to the team and shout out to you always. I really appreciate sharing space with you and then you offering your platform to talk about this important topic.
Likewise.
In the book, I use the acronym PILES because we can imagine there's piles of history and trauma and debt and repair that are needed to be attended to. Those piles: P, political reparations; I, intellectual reparations; L, legal reparations; E, economic reparations; S, spatial, social, and spiritual reparations. Those represent the 7 forms. And I also offer that 7 is also understood as a supreme number. So the idea here is that we're talking in a way that's much more holistic and comprehensive so that we can repair all of the damage and also think about it in a more expansive way.
Mm. Let's go to chapter 2 in this book. We talked a little bit about Sambo's Smile, chapter 1,
Mhm.
the last time you were here. And that story just, you know how some characters live with you beyond your reading of the book. I feel like Sambo like continues to sort of help guide in some ways. It's really surreal. But I want to start today's conversation with the parable of Jubilee. And audience, don't worry, we're not doing the whole book today. We're going to sit in this topic for a while. Dr. Hunter has agreed to give us some time on hopefully enough of a regular basis that we can get as much out of this as we can, for which we are grateful. But the parable of Jubilee, this is a story or a conversation that takes place in South Carolina. Talk to us about which of the acronyms this particular story speaks to when it comes to the form of reparations you deal with in this version.
Yeah, for sure. So for folks listening in, we all know that General Sherman's Special Order Number 15 is where the famous 40 Acres and a Mule originates.
Mm.
And according to the Souls of Black Folk, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, he talks about how in 1865, there were Black folks who settled land in Georgia and parts of South Carolina, except during Reconstruction, it was taken away. The parable begins from the premise of what if that taking away never happened? What if it's 1965, 100 years later, and what started off as a couple of plots of land have turned into a third the size of South Carolina,
Mm.
all centered in a town called Jubilee. And so the idea is that we begin right at the beginning of understanding 40 acres and a mule as a form of spatial repair, land-based repair where people were given land. Then there's this quest for political representation that they're on as well. So you're seeing political reparations. And then the big overhead hanging over the top is the idea that their independence as a state or a territory is up for discussion as a part of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So then
Mm.
we're seeing legal reparations as well on the table. So you see at least 3 primary forms happening all together, though I would fold in that social reparations is happening as versions of the protagonist, Ruby, who is the sort of like spokesperson. Think Malcolm X. Ruby is the spokesperson for Jubilee, spreading the news about Jubilee's existence across the United States for over 10 years leading to this moment, performing a version of social repair so that people are aware that it's happening. And as the story unfolds, you see that there is a kind of multi forms of religion that are present. So we're seeing some spiritual repair happening, though we don't hear a lot of economic repair in this particular story. So different forms are happening, but mostly anchored in particular, the spatial repair that we think about with 40 acres and a mule. What would happen if we were 100 years later and 40 acres and a mule had turned into 400,000 acres or 4 million acres of Black land in South Carolina?
Now, the idea, just you saying that last part, what if 40 acres it was now 400,000? And it is something, the concept of which I think for a lot of Black people who are thinking about reparations is like, yes, Dr. Marcus Anthony Hunter, that's exactly what we wanted. 40 acres and a mule. We want this land. It was our land. And they took it back from us. And I think that that is such a powerful call emotionally, spiritually to those of us who come from that legacy. Before we delve more into that, let's talk about the story format, because your use of parables is epic. Why that particular storytelling trope or tool?
Yeah, it's just like we originally talked about. Shout out to Professor Derek Bell, shout
Yes.
out to Professor Octavia Butler, and
Mm,
the mission I think they both give in using and utilizing parables. And we would be remiss if we didn't say shout out to Jesus,
come
Son
on.
of Mary, Son of God, using parables as well as his major teaching tool in order to help people understand that they had already been forgiven. So
Mm,
the idea is that, if you can put something into a parable, it's a ancient form where a way of teaching and understanding is happening without the teacher pressing you to believe something or to agree with something. So you just try to create a world that feels real for folks so that they can envision it for themselves and then start to figure out, what is the takeaway lesson for me? What is the takeaway for the story? What am I taking away from it? Because I ultimately wanted people to walk away with their own notion of what reparations could look like.
yeah.
What does spatial repair look like for you? Especially as you're talking, many people are joining the ranks of commissions across the country, and there's no one size fits all. New York is different from California, is different from Massachusetts, and the needs are going to be different. But if you can imagine the forms, you might be able to arrive at something that really is custom and tailored to the needs on the ground where you are.
Mm. And on the ground where we are is contested, right?
Right.
On the grounds where we are, because a lot of the claims that we make about spatial reparations in particular are based to some claim to land.
Absolutely.
And that works in our favor if the land is originally owned by the people from whom we would be securing it. But one of the things that this particular parable of the story of Jubilee, one of the things that, and when I tell, before, I just want to say, brother, you didn't have to do that the way you did that. Like that hammer drop, I feel like I didn't throw the book because I was on the train. But had I not been on New York City subways when I was finishing this particular parable, I would have tossed that sucker. I'm like, how dare you, Dr. Marcus Anthony Hunter? Because in this parable, you so powerfully tease out the work that
Mhm.
this Black community has done for for 100 years.
Yeah,
The
right.
work of preserving this land, painstakingly expanding on the land, building it out. And while economics is not necessarily explicitly described, none of these things could happen without some sort of viable economic growth and development. So for me, it was unstated, but it was certainly there. The religious component, I was
Yeah.
like, well, this is genius, because there is not going to be any Black liberation under one, at least in my opinion, under
Mhm.
one particular religious outlook. There has to be the capacity for us to be as diversified in our religious perspectives as were the groupings in Wakanda, if you need like a non-fiction, I mean, a fiction, non-real sort of imagining of what that could look like. But the work that they had done,
Mhm.
the claim that they had,
Mhm.
was only valid so long as the land giver was
Mhm.
the proper owner of that land in the first place. And you tease out the complexity of that in a way that was really upsetting and I mean empowering but
Yeah,
upsetting.
right,
Talk to
right.
us about some of those complexities. We don't have to give away the whole thing, but
Yeah,
talk to us
yeah.
about those complexities.
I really appreciate your take on it. That's exactly the goal. Like, I think, one of the major things I wanted to address was this issue of land and the conundrum that is the United States of America, where
Mm,
we also hear about native land dispossession. We hear about native claims to lands. We hear that Black people in the United States are originally from Africa. So we hear all of this land talk and where people's land are and all of these other things. But during, especially in the pandemic period, we started to hear about this rise of Black home ownership and Black land buying, where people were just creating collectives and buying land across the American South as a way of, a kind of DIY reparations around spatial repair. And I think that's really industrious on one level, but there's some historical questions about the origin of America that are underneath that I
Right.
think we need to really think about. And one of the guiding points for me, which won't give away the plot here, but will tell you a lot about the book in general, is the tension that I feel as an African American understanding American history, that there is this way that America is going to America.
Mm.
So what happens if reparations comes? What kind of safety net and protections are
Yes.
African Americans going to have around it? So one thing I didn't visit, but I'll use here as an example because it doesn't give away anything, is what if we were paid the cash money, in hand, like 3 6 Mafia says, better put the money in my hand, in my
Right.
hand.
In
So they
my
put the
hand.
money in our hand. There is something to be said for America then having the system called the Federal Reserve that might actually create a situation where the dollar is significantly worth less until such time that those reparations dollars have been spent or utilized by the African American population. That is something that always rolls back in the
Wow.
back of my mind of what if we do get our restitution or our repair or whatever combination of that is, what are the protections around what we receive from the government? Because
Mm.
we know, for example, even with the Civil Rights Acts that we all see, we're seeing the Voting Rights Act that I mentioned here being rolled back. So,
Right.
what are the protections around the kinds of redress that you do receive? Because America will America on Black people. And so,
Yeah.
this parable was a way to really get at that without having it be that these things were handed to this community. This community built this over 100
Yes.
years, and their
Yes.
only request is to be acknowledged for real. Like I watch a lot of wrestling, and Roman Reigns is the head of it. And he always has this phrase, he comes out and he says, acknowledge me. That's what
Mm.
you're asking for. And in the quest of acknowledgement, that still takes you down a very kind of American track where you start to see how unprotected Black people are, even
Mm.
when the government is supposed to be doing the right thing by them.
Right. And this for me, it unearthed a lot of the questions that I had around some of those claims to the 5 states. So when I was much, much younger, I came to an understanding of reparations through the work of Incobra, right? And part
Mhm.
of the work that they do also includes, claiming this region of land. And one of the ways that I've heard this envisioned was, these are the states where most of us were enslaved and labored. And so these southeastern 5 states are where should be set aside for this particular group of people. And even back in my, Africana Studies major days when I was at Penn State and in grappling with the things that we were thinking about, as much as I was attracted to that, one of my questions was, well, having access to that land works if, again, the original owners of the land are the ones who are conceding it to you. But
Mhm.
if the land you are claiming was only occupied by force and by theft, then
Mhm.
the people from whom you are seeking reparations are not the people for whom giving that land is a right. They don't have the right to give you that land because they are not themselves sitting on that land properly. So
Mhm.
the idea of having access to these 5 southern states, and now that we see more and more maps that describe the indigenous
Yes, right.
nations that were here before. And so we're not just seeing, the states, but we're seeing over the state, a map of the United States, the layout of the different indigenous nations. The argument for physical land being set aside for enslaved Africans makes sense until we remember that there is a superseding claim, which a phrase that we use in the law, a superseding claim to that very same land from the indigenous Americans who are still here and who were originally here. And that tension I don't necessarily hear being discussed in as
Right.
thoroughly as I think it would have to be if we were serious about spatial reparations in a way that can acknowledge, okay, the indigenous still here, right? Like I know we're doing these land acknowledgments and then we go about our business sitting
Right.
on this occupied land that we just acknowledged, but they still here. And if the claims to land are tied to ownership, then that is a wrinkle that I don't know many in the reparations or many people who are thinking about reparations are necessarily focusing on. I don't want to say it's not being discussed or studied or analyzed, but in the popular discourse of reparations, that element I don't see coming up as much. I don't know if you see it differently.
Yeah, I I would say is bubbling underneath because so much of the reparations conversation is about American history.
Yeah.
So if we're talking about American history, the experience and the history of indigenous and native folks is right there. So
Mm,
part of what happens in the same way that native and indigenous folks have bubbling underneath the surface the idea that there were enslaved Black Africans in the midst, some
right.
of which were owned by some of what are considered the five civilized tribes. So
Mm,
this is something that a tension. Now, for me, it's a creative tension because it doesn't have to mean you don't get it, but I do think that it's something worth thinking about. And my job, and I think this is back to Professor Derek Bell and Afrolantica, which is part of one of the inspirations
mm,
where the island pops up adjacent to the United States. The United States says, hey, this could be reparations for people. And then the Black people debate, go back and forth. A few, let's call them the Cobras, they get on a boat, they go there to claim it, and it sinks underneath the ground. The
mm,
end.
right.
After all of this build up and everything, the actual thing you're arguing about is actually disappearing as the parable closes. And I think it's because what he allows you to do and understand with the parable is not about the place or the land or the event. It's about getting into the psyche of the American experience, into the psyche of how Black people think politically.
Mm,
About, like,
mm.
I mean, for example, one of my favorite things about the parable of Jubilee is there's this a lawyer in it, Geneva Crenshaw, who I completely lift from Faces at the Bottom of the Well. Every
Okay, I thought so. All right. Okay, okay. I'm good. I'm good. I was like, oh, I can see it. I can see it.
I deeply lift her from that book, and in his book and Derek Bell's book, she's kind of his the person on his shoulder, like the kind of counter lawyer who's saying you're all about this getting rid of racism. What if racism is here to stay? And this is how we could deal with racism. The first sets of, I want to say 2/3 of what she says in that chapter are directly from what she says to him in his book. And she had this idea of, like, rather than fighting racism, what if we just created a racial preference law where races could select into it? And basically, what would happen is that then people don't use their business over time, versus trying to make them be illegal in their discriminatory practices. And
Right.
so it's like, well, if you're, Jubilee, South Carolina, and Black people start having all of this land, there's going to be lawsuits. So who's going to
Mm,
be their lawyer? Geneva Crenshaw is going to be their lawyer, and she's going to present the case to them as she presented it to Derek Bell, and they're going to be moved by her, and she's going to represent them. And I also think that she helps to demonstrate the different legal arguments that people have had about racism and
right.
how we can legally get to legislation like the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act. So she was such an important through line, and also was such a Black lawyer. Even when you read his book, you're like, that sounds like a Black lady lawyer.
Yes.
Like,
She black. I know she
right,
black. You
definitely,
ain't got to tell me what she look like. She black.
definitely, definitely.
Oh man. So this to me is one of the complicating challenges that we have to reconcile with, because I feel like there is a disproportionate, and maybe it's because I'm entering this conversation through the way that I'm entering it, but there is what I feel like a disproportionate discussion about we deserve reparations. Where's the reparations? No reparations, no vote.
Yeah.
And I've reminded people on these airways, I've reminded people in other conversations, as you described, we did initially get a set of reparations. Some of us got a set of reparations. That general order, that initial outlay of land, that was a form of reparations. It wasn't the getting of it that was a problem. It was the inability to keep it. And what you referenced in terms of what could happen, I say they give us that cash money, cash rule everything around. They give it in our hand, and then they devalue the dollar until such time that whatever reparations dollars we got are reabsorbed back into the American economy, and then the dollar value rises again, and we're just sort of asked out. And then they say, well, we gave you your reparations. I don't know what you mad about.
Right.
I don't know that we're having as many in-depth conversations about what it would take to keep it. The
Right.
getting of it is just a phase, but it's the keeping of it, the protecting of it, and the inability for the person who gave it to you to be able to manipulate the way in which you then appreciate, use, spend, invest. And that to me is a real missing part of the conversation. And part of the reason I think it's so missing is because that thing you did in that chapter and the way that you did it I don't know that there are answers for that. And I feel as though we keep focusing on one part of the conversation because this other part of the conversation, I don't know that we have seen a lot of good answers for that open question.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, ultimately, I think, I appeal to the imagination because if we can imagine it, we can manifest it. And if I can present it as a foil, then there's a way to imagine a solution.
Mm,
And for example, even on the issue of social repair. So this is one form of reparations that doesn't cost money per se, no direct financial exchange from person to person, but it may cost money for the governments who authorized, constitutionalized, and sanctioned enslavement to pay to, produce this infrastructure of information. One form is, for example, we hear about land acknowledgement,
mm.
which I think is very important, but we don't hear a labor acknowledgement. What if
Oh,
every time we're in Washington, D.C., you have to say, this is the land of the Anacostan people, unceded, so on as we do. And this city was designed and built by enslaved Black Africans and their
huh.
descendants. That doesn't cost money, but it does help to not weaponize the Native and Indigenous experience at the expense of
Wow.
enslaved Africans. Because what we know, or what we should know, is that these are simultaneous injuries that
Mm,
authorize the creation of America. But when we
yes.
do labor acknowledgement, it's only acknowledging one aspect of that simultaneous story or injury.
Wow.
The other one, we are, as African Americans, participating in saying the land acknowledgement, though our labor has built many of the buildings, many of the streets, roads, pathways, and cities that we now call America. But we're not hearing that labor acknowledgement. So
Mm.
that's another example of a way to creatively think around how do we attend to the simultaneity of the injuries to the Native and Indigenous people and Black African people at the same time.
Is there a way for us to engage in dialogue with the indigenous community about perhaps a collective approach to reparations out of recognition of those mutual injuries that gave birth to this space? And is there a vision of is there a way to achieve reparations without engaging the indigenous community in that dialogue, acknowledging that some indigenous communities did indeed also enslave and vis-a-vis. So what are your thoughts on that sort of third prong entering the discourse? Because it's like, indigenous communities entering the chat. Like I feel like we've been in the chat, they ain't even in the chat, and they need to enter the chat because otherwise, all the things that you tease out, and I'm getting mad just thinking about the ending of that damn parable. Like all the things that you tease out are going to unleash this a new battle, this new need for dialogue, and by that point, it's almost too late. We lost the plot at that point. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, about 5 years ago, I received a call from Congresswoman Barbara Lee asking if I would help work on and then later draft and advise the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation bill, which would create the first ever U.S. Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Commission. And the idea there is that that would be the fertile soil to have that kind of dialogue and discussion, where
Mm,
we can keep, HR 40 and reparations in the African American space as it should be, but then
right.
to have a broader conversation about truth and healing and repair. Most people remember Truth and Reconciliation. This is a rebrand of that as a way to encapsulate a broader conversation about all of the communities. We've had great support in the reparations space from our Japanese American brothers and sisters
Right.
and about the pathway and lessons learned. But also, when I first started with Congresswoman Lee, one of the first original co-sponsors was then Congresswoman Deb Haaland, who is now Secretary Deb Haaland of the Interior. And she's taken that model of TRHT and introduced it from her angle, her vantage point, and that's focused a lot on Indian boarding schools. For
Oh,
folks
wow.
who don't know about them, there's a great film called Sugarcane
Mm,
that is in circulation right now. I highly recommend people to see it. And it covers that, in this kind of period where you have enslavement and then you have some sharecropping, you also get these Indian boarding schools, which were basically brainwashing and death camps for Native and Indigenous folks, where they were forced into them. They were brutalized. Many of them were raped and murdered and killed. Their children killed, incinerated. We learn.
mm,
Um, and often under the guise of the Catholic Church, doing all of this, but with the support of the US government and the Canadian government. And so the idea is that there is a very fertile place to have that conversation, to put all of that harm in context so that we can start to see that there are so many allies in what was our victimhood, now our survivinghood. Like, how can we all thrive together and understand that there's a way that we're all due something from the government that authorized our dehumanization. So I think, a truth space is really important, which is why we've been advocating for a truth space alongside a reparative space, so that we think about reparations as part of a larger umbrella of reparative justice, so that people also don't get to just solo target African American reparations as the only thing that we're talking about, as a way to say, oh, well, that's just for one group. No, when we're talking about reparative justice, that applies across the board, because there's so many groups that have been at the disadvantage of what should be a holistically advantageous society called the United States of America.
Mm. We have a lot to figure out. And I feel as though a lot of the folks who are screaming into the void are doing some of the least bit of educating when it comes to this particular topic. So I'm so grateful for this particular type of approach. I love parables, and I think it's because Derek Bell was like, no, you have permission to write in your own voice. Like, he was like, no, what you're going to do is write in your voice. I don't need you writing in some academic voice. I need you to speak in a way that your people can understand. So for those of you who get upset that I be not confusing, I also be selectively using Ebonics or African American vernacular English, and then I can switch into the King's English and do what's necessary, because we also have to recognize time and place. This is why, because we should be able to be fluid across our identities and how we move, so that we can have a more robust discussion. And being able to tell stories in parable format is such a powerful tool. So this is not a book, y'all, that you got to be an academician to read, although academicians should be reading it. Is that a word, academician?
Yeah,
Academic?
that is.
Yeah, okay, all right. I had a brain fart for a moment. But this is not, you don't have to, you don't need a thesaurus. You need to love a good story.
Right.
Because, child, you are a storyteller, because it's all of this political, historical context in what feels like you're reading the best novel ever. And that, I think, is a true gift. And that's one of the reasons why I'm really recommending those of you who are interested in the topic of reparations, maybe you're deeply steeped in it, maybe you're brand new to it. This is one of those books that I think would be able to appeal to people across those lines in a way that, frankly, is necessary. Especially if you ain't serious about reparations, well then, just read it for pleasure, because it's also a very pleasurable read. But if you're serious about it, we got to have a broader conversation about the approaches that we're taking. Dr. Marcus Anthony Hunter, I can't wait till we get to the next chapter. We've got Little Sambo that we've talked about. We got the Parable of Jubilee, and then we're going to go to the Parable of New Jerusalem, Uganda. And child, oh my God, there was another one of them book throwing moments at the end of the chapter. Really well done. Really, really, really well done, sir. Really well done. What's the best way for people to follow you, connect with you, interact with you off these airwaves?
Yeah, I am Marcus Anthony Hunter on IG, M. Anthony Hunter on Twitter. You can find me marcusanthonyhunter.com, and also at UCLA, so African American Studies or Sociology there. So at least 5 ways that you can get up in my business.
There we go. And it's good business. It's good business.